Welcome everybody to today's Honors Presents on Ahoy Flavor Country, Crafting Worlds That Mean Something. Author and playwright Kent Davis is going to speak about the creative writing process and the meaning of world building within storytelling. So we begin, as usual, with our land acknowledgement. We begin by acknowledging with honor and respect the Indigenous nations on whose traditional territories the university now stands, and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We also acknowledge the elders, past and present, including MSU's current Council of Elders, and humbly ask for their guidance. The Valley of the Flowers has been and remains a place of learning for Native American peoples who for millennia have passed ways of knowing, being, and doing from one generation to the next. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it is an important social justice and decolonial practice that promotes Indigenous visibility and a reminder that we are on settled Indigenous land. Professor Davis has spent most of his life making stories. He is an author, professor, game designer, improviser, and actor. His critically acclaimed kidlit fantasy steampunk trilogy, A Riddle in Ruby, features brave girls, fake pirates, and ferocious gearbeasts. It is on sale everywhere you can buy books. He is an assistant teaching professor in the Honors College and the School of Film and Photography, and is currently up to his eyeballs in a National Science Foundation grant focused on teaching doctorate students how to tell stories for science and research. He's the principal of Snake Oil Workshop, which has worked with clients as varied as Zoot Enterprises, Gallatin Valley Land Trust, and the Atlanta Falcons organization. Kent and his game design partner, Chris Organ, are the two geeks behind the Ennie Award-nominated Epic RPG tabletop gaming system. Kent's theater endeavors have been seen in theaters from Los Angeles to Philadelphia to Vancouver to Edinburgh. Film and television credits as a short, bald man include an array of concerned friends, overbearing flunkies, and odd yet amusing next-door neighbors. He holds a BA in English from the University of Pennsylvania and a Master of Fine Arts in Acting from University of California, San Diego. He lives on the north side with his sweetie and a clever dog ninja named Linus. And without further ado, Kent, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Maeve. Okay, hi everybody. Hope you're doing okay on this lovely afternoon, and I'm so psyched that you took some time out of your day to talk about stories. I'm looking out the window and there's like sun and sky, so I do appreciate you staring at a screen for another hour. So this whole talk is going to be about while it's about building worlds, it's also about the creative process and making stuff up. When I was talking with the Honors Presents crew originally about the conception of this idea, one of the targets that we wanted to hit was first years, especially in the T&C program, who are working on essentially crafting a story of their own in a couple of weeks. So this is going out to you, but hopefully it's going to have a lot to do, if that's not you, with, I don't know, stuff that you might be interested in. And so that's the start of the talk. But actually what I want to start with is this. Okay, so it's a map, actually. It was made in the 19th century by a guy named Francois Minard, and it's excellent. It is a visual statistical retelling of Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia during the winter of 1812 and 1813. Some modern information scientists say that it may be the best statistical graphic ever drawn, and Wikipedia told me that, so you know, there. There are 6 informational axes, and I can't see you all because I'm looking at my screen. So if anybody wants to take a stab at what the informational axes might be, in other words, what is it trying to track? Here's a version in English. Just shout it out, or if you could just like speak into chat, or also into the meeting, or talk in the chat, that'd be great. What is it tracking, do you think?
Looks like temperature is one of them.
Yeah, temperature, that's right. What else? Anyone?
I see in the title it says number of men
Yes.
or not.
Well done. So yeah, the number of troops, temperature. Look closer at the background of the graph.
Looks like I see almost like a map headed towards Moscow.
It is a map. It is a map that basically goes from the border of Russia to Moscow and back. So the direction, the distance that and also the distance that traveled, right? There are a number of lines there, latitude and longitude, and also the location of Napoleon's army relative to specific dates. Right, and you can see it's such a big army where it starts out, and then it arrives in Moscow, and then it turns into this tiny, tiny little group of, so 422,000 to start out with, 10,000 returned from this like ridiculous, insane sort of I don't know, fever dream wild goose chase. So in addition to being a sweet map, this is a really great story. It has all the qualities I look for in a great story. It has stakes that are miles high, right? It's the fate of empires. It has ambition. It has crystal clarity. It has tragedy. It has a bit of brutality and just a boatload of the absurd. And I think the interesting thing about this map too is that there's not really any moralizing, right? It doesn't say anywhere on the map, Napoleon was a bad guy. It doesn't say, how amazing were the Russians? It doesn't even say, what idiot invades Russia in the middle of winter? It's just there, right? It tells it like it is, and you, who are the target audience, can interpret it as you will. And one really important thing about building a story and a world for a story, I think, is like this really excellent map. And this is a little bit of a sort of a matrix moment, but the world of the story is the map. The map is the story, and the story is, in essence, the world of the story. Yeah, okay. Thank you for coming to see my talk. No, my technique, if you can call it a technique, this is... I don't know, my advice really, if you're trying to come up with like a new setting to put a story into, is it starts out really simply. Basically, it starts out with a simple question, which is what if? Right? So, here are 3 what if scenarios. What if the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II and split the North American continent, like an appetizer at Applebee's, right? Oops. That's The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, okay? What if part of your soul ran around with you like a customized talking animal companion? Oh, and plus there are sapient armored polar bears. Okay, well, the answer is The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. Right? So what if you put a post-Civil War Western into space with, I don't know, cursing in Chinese? Then you get Firefly, right? It's not that simple. But the idea here is that what if can be your way in to a story if you let it. How do you fill out the rest of that sentence? What if blank, right? How do you supply that information, right? Where do the ideas come from? You read and you watch stories. You pay attention to the world around you. You talk and you think about what excites you. One of my favorite quotes is by a poet named Mary Oliver. And it's very simple. It's recipe for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. You can find ideas for stories in the smallest interactions. You can find them in the natural world. You can find them in what you do in your own life. It's about being specific and about allowing yourself to be excited and not too worried about making a perfect idea. Asking questions like what if blank that you don't yet know the answer to. And also being brave and being courageous enough to be like, okay, well, I don't know if this is going to be interesting, but I'm interested, so I'm going to write it down and trust that if you're interested, other people will be interested too. For me, this process started pretty early. I'm like the entire arc of my life, I would say, is like I say in my bio, is about it. The one thing that links it is I'm an old hand at reading stories, if not telling them. And I started reading them, of all places, in a library. I spent my 0 to 10 years in a little town called Warrensburg, Missouri. And there's a university there. And my father, who had just retired from the Air Force, was pursuing an English teaching degree as his sort of next step, his what if, right? And my folks were divorced, not a ton of money. And when he and I were hanging on the weekends and he had a particularly heavy homework load, we would go to the library. And he used to kind of, I have to admit, how to say this, use the library as daycare. And to all the librarians out there in the ether, thank you for being so understanding about the Cheeto stains. Okay, so anyway, there I am about 6 or 7, I think, and my dad's doing his thing, and it's a small town, and it's a pretty big building, and we'll just withhold any judgment on my father's parenting style, please and thank you. So anyway, I'm wandering around in the stacks, and which I think was for me at least kind of the most delicious experience to provide a kid ever. Like it really is, like it's the stacks smell funny and old, and it's just so mysterious that deeper and deeper you go. And I don't think I had read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by this time, but it was easy for me to believe that if I just followed the stacks far enough back, I would find myself in another world. There's a theme here, which is kind of what happened. I found deep in the stacks a copy of Bullfinch's mythology. Not at all like this one. This one is clean and sleek, and it has a cool piece of art on it. But my memory is that of a copy that had no jacket, and it had a horrible powder blue worn fabric cover, and it was dusty and not in a good way. You know, like really kind of a sticky way. And not a lot of call for Bullfinch in that part of Missouri, no judgment. But so anyway, I read the off of that book because it had stories about the Greeks and the Romans, and plus it had King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot, all pre-plague polyamorous, and plus all the wackadoo Roland and Charlemagne stuff, and I ate it like candy and I was hooked. And sometimes I think, what if I hadn't found that book in that library? What if I had missed out on that world, on those worlds? What would my story have been? Because I really didn't have what you call parental antecedent toward the mythic. That wasn't our family story. My parents worked hard and strove to be good people, but it's not like I had access to dragons or deep elves or the Green Man or Arthur's sword Excalibur or Roland's sword Durandal. So when I say I found my calling in a library and the first step of my what if happened there, I really, really mean it. Flash forward to my junior year at college, and this is my junior year at college. It's 3 a.m. I'm hanging upside down from a lighting grid and 30 feet off the theater floor because I'm dating a lighting designer, and that's how you get to keep dating the lighting designer, right? But it was actually more than that. I had gotten my Kansas public school self to UPenn in Philadelphia through a combination of parental grit and work study and grants and the like. And I still love books, but the ephemeral right now quality of telling stories in the theater had hooked me, and it wouldn't let go. And the plan was to finish well, take the LSATs, go to law school somewhere in DC, and then work staff for some bleeding heart congressperson on the Hill. However, at that moment, up in the lighting grid, and it was not just the lighting designer, I'm telling you, I realized, and if there's any faculty in this present in this chat, cover your ears. I realized that it was much more important to me to finish the hang for this show, the lighting hang for the show, than it was to turn in a big paper in my introduction to law class the next morning. Because I found the story more compelling. Because I found the story we were going to tell in that theater more important than a possible career in the halls of the suited and the litigious. Anyone who is going that way, again, no judgment there. I love lawyers. The other thing I loved and still love about theater, though, is that as a play, as written, as text, right, as lines on a page, it's unfinished. It's like a musical score. No one comes to see Dean Lee to watch her sit down and pull out that gorgeous cello and like hold up a piece of sheet music. That would be kind of weird. They come to see her play and to see her interpret the notes on the page through her artistic prowess and to see them collaborate, the score and the player and the instrument, to create a hearing of that piece of music that will never be heard in that exact way again. It is an of the moment thing. Some of my hardcore skiing friends talk the same way about an epic run off the ridge at Bridger, right? It's a fire in the night. It happens and then it's gone. Theater is the same way. The script of the play is the skeleton. The actors, the director, the designers, the crew, the people running concessions, they furnish that skeleton with flesh and brain and heart. And the audience is part of that too. And this is something to think about when you're thinking about making stories and telling stories to other people. The play or the musical composition or even the written story isn't complete until it lands in the audience. It's only when it's processed that it's finished. When someone processes it or laughs or cries or walks out of the theater, like giving you the bird, that's the only time that the story is made whole. And all of the stuff in you and around you is fuel for that an event, and experience a world that happens inside of the audience. And I think that thing about the audience fills in the rest has always been one of my favorite qualities about world building and stories. No matter how many words and images you're using, there's a point when you just can't provide any more information and the audience has to fill in the blank. And that fill in the blank moment is a crazy, amazing thing about us storytelling animals. It's so personal. And that is when the story becomes the person who's reading it. That's when that ownership happens, right? How many of you out there read Harry Potter before seeing the first movie, right? Maybe some of you. Think back all those years. And when you read it, did Harry Potter look like this? Or like this? I mean, I just had to put a little beefcake in for the Harry Potter fans. Okay. Or what about Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games, right? If you read the Hunger Games, did she look like that? Or Frodo? I mean, please, I hope this wasn't what Frodo looked like. It certainly wasn't for me. Okay, bye, Frodo. I wish I could erase you from my brain forever. Ugh. Ugh. Okay, so this, I'm sorry, I have a real problem with the casting of that movie. Just coming back out. I'm coming back out of sharing mode. So this participation and this fact that the story isn't finished until we finish it inside us means that all of us are storytellers. We have to be. And this is something to really own as you go and you're like, I don't know, I'm a biochemist. What are you doing, TNC faculty? Asking me to tell a story and make stuff up? This is lame. You already are, okay? You just have to allow yourself to be. Here's a story. Here's a story. I have this image in my head, okay? That was walking around inside of my head for a while. And it's not of Frodo. Oh God, Frodo, go away. It's of a huntress who comes back to the cave and the fire. And she tells the story of a tiger kill. And she's eloquent. She talks about the razor edge of her flint-tipped spear, And she talks about the tiger's size. She tells about it. It's bigger than she thought it would be. It's huge. It's lean power, the low, throaty chuff it makes in its throat as it circles. Nothing at all like a purr. Its muscles bunching, the way time slows as it leaps. I see that story in my head, just like the people around this fire, and maybe you do too. But it's most likely significantly different than the actual experience of our huntress. And why is that? Well, I'm sure there's a raft of neuroscientists and psychologists and philosophers of self, many of whom some of you had read in TNC, that could tell you their theories of the mechanisms involved, the equipment, right? But I am a comedian and a storyteller, so here's what I think. Or rather, here's what Wayland Teach thinks. And he's the captain of a troupe of fake pirates that takes celebrities on cruises to provide them a true pirate experience, TM, in an alternate history, steampunk, fantasy, colonial America. We'll probably talk about that in a bit. But here's what Captain Teach says. Quote, "We are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves." I agree with him. I mean, I wrote him. A big hunk of who I am and who you are is the stories that we've heard about us from our parents, from our friends, from our teachers, from our enemies. You know how they go. You're so smart. You're so stupid. You're so pretty. You're so angry. Those stories from the people closest to us and the stories we tell ourselves, those words become part of us, our blood, our marrow, our fuel. And this becomes incredibly important when we start thinking of who we think we are and who we want to be, or rather, how we want to be. One of the questions that is endlessly fascinating to me is this: can we shift our experience in the world and our impact on the world, our identities, by telling ourselves a slightly different story from the ones that have been told to us or from our previous ones? In other words, can the story I tell myself about myself change me or alter me or even heal me? Now, I'm not saying that if I wake up every morning and tell myself a story about, how I will eventually grow adamantium claws that go snick in the night and out of my knuckles, and that I will also develop superhuman strength and healing powers with which I will solve crimes. I'm not saying that if I tell myself that over and over that will happen, because I have to tell you, friends, dear reader, that I have tried, and I have tried so hard, and it has just not happened to me. But if the story is somehow along the lines of, I can have an impact on my future, or I do actually have a stay in my destiny, or I am good enough or worthy enough or human enough, well, then we're talking. And I don't want to get too TED Talky about this, so I'll turn away a bit from our own personal identities to fictional identities and the worlds in which those fictional identities live, because it's frankly territory I feel much more comfortable with. We may circle back around. So fictional identities, the characters that you make. This is my book. This is one of my book babies. It's called A Riddle in Ruby. It's about an awesome girl who gets in all kinds of awesome trouble because she's awesome. That's my version. But here we are at telling stories again. And anyone, hopefully some of you know what an elevator pitch is. I'll tell you, it's the thing that you're supposed to have in your back pocket so you can pitch your book or your movie idea or your job opportunity to really important people you're sharing an elevator with. It's a great skill to cultivate, and I am terrible at it. My publisher, however, is better at that sort of thing, and here's what they say. Ruby Teach, daughter of a smuggler and pirate, has been learning how to swindle and steal and pick the most complex locks for as long as she can remember. But a collision with aristocratic young Lord Athens sends her spinning into chaos. Little did she know that her whole life has been spent in hiding from nefarious secret societies and the Royal Navy, who are now both on her trail. In this debut middle grade adventure, Kent Davis weaves a rip-roaring tale through an alternate colonial Philadelphia, a world where alchemy, that peculiar mix of magic and science, has fueled the Industrial Revolution. With this highly original setting, a cast full of rounded characters and rapid-fire dialogue, blah, blah, it's good, blah, 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 right? But better than awesome girl getting into all kinds of awesome trouble. And that's the power of story, right? That's the first one. Oh, there's a second one. It's A Riddle in Ruby, The Changer's Key. And there's the third one. It's A Riddle in Ruby, The Great Unravel. The reason I'm sharing you with this is not because I want to be like, hey, it's my book, buy it. But to tell you that when I started my first novel, I had no idea how to write a book, much like many of you perhaps have no idea how to like start writing a story. I think many of you may be in a similar position where you're thinking Project 3 is coming up and I have no effing idea how to write something. This may help a little bit. So I had no idea how to write a book. So I started telling myself, but most definitely not other people, a story, considering the possibility that I could. And the way that I started telling myself that story was through just a series of images. And I started off with a particularly powerful image, and I walked around it. I walked around with it for days in my head. It was dramatic. It was mysterious. It was charged with power and purpose. And this is it. Yeah. Super powerful. I'm not an artist. There was a girl in a tricorn hat with in a whiskey barrel with sort of mechanized, sort of mecha legs. And I messed around with that idea for a really, really long time, and I didn't know where it was going to take me, and I didn't know what it was about. I didn't have a finished story at all. It was just this small idea. But finally, I started thinking, I let it sort of play out, and I made some sketches, and I wrote a lot of stuff, like random stuff down, and then I started fixating on the tricorn hat. And I was like, oh, cool, a tricorn hat, which led me along a trail to the idea of, I've always been fascinated with what the colonial landscape, the continental landscape looked like before, well, certainly before white people got here and did our own sort of dance on the situation. But that's a different story, right? But like, I started thinking about like the idea that at one point Pennsylvania was the frontier for the colonials, right? It was the edge of the world. And then I started thinking, well, what if the stories that people told in those times might have actually been real? Or what would it be like to live in a world where they were real, right? And that led me to folk tales, mostly by loggers and hunters, about that landscape. And a lot of them were French. This is a ball-tailed cat. It's a cat. It's like a big hunting cat. I don't think that there's any fossil evidence of ball-tailed cats around, right? But they would hang out in trees and like jump down at you and pounce upon you, and in the air like twist around and bonk you on the head with these big club tails. Like so, essentially, a kind of a magical pre-Revolutionary War landscape. Here's another great story. The voyageurs, who were French trappers, they had a reputation of being so fast and so good at what they did. And they could get to places that other trappers couldn't. That people started telling stories about this. Essentially, it's called La Chasse Galerie, right? If you look down at the credit in the corner. They were like, oh, wow, there are the French trappers, they have these magic boats that they sail through the air to get all the best furs and stuff. And so there's this constant, like, I started taking little pieces from here and there, and I started matching them up to build a world that I wanted to tell a story in. Another thing I was really excited about was the magic of the world, right? Which you heard in the description was a combination of alchemy and chemistry and science, and really just like things that would do something like this. right? I hope that this video is happening to you in real time. But it's essentially, I'm describing it, it's essentially a real piece of tin being exposed to incredibly low temperatures and decomposing itself. And I was wondering, like, what if scientists or chemists could actually do that with the power of their own mojo? Here's another thing that I found, because I started doing a lot of surfing of YouTube videos, right? And sorry, this happens, and then there's a giant, and then and I was thinking, wow, that would be really, really sweet if that could appear in a story. So it's not anything incredibly, it's not incredibly complex. And I guess what I'm trying to say is the idea of following your nose with regard to idea creation is really about collecting bits and pieces that you care about and fitting them together in a way that is exciting to you. And I was thinking about, oh yeah, then the whole idea of like democracy and Voltaire, and I wanted dueling with swords, and it eventually ends up in this place where, because I am a speculative fiction junkie, and what is speculative fiction? It is the coded secret name that nerds use for fantasy and science fiction so that we can, teach classes about it in the academy. Anyway, I love elves and magic. I love, and I put a heroine in there that was a strong girl because I wanted to have a main character that was strong, but her strength was not about the fact that she was kicking ass. I wanted to tell a story about a hero that my sweetie Anna would have aspired to when she was a girl, and a hero I would have aspired to be when I was a boy. And that brings us full circle to the idea of stories shaping us. There's a fascinating bit of research that I came upon this morning, or actually a while ago, that just blew my mind. So one of the assumptions we've had about fairy tales, for example, all of those recorded by the Brothers Grimm, right? One example. The Academy basically thought that they were about 100 years older than they were when they were first written down. So like sometime in the early 1300s, or maybe a little bit earlier. Now, Wilhelm Grimm himself wrote that he believed some of the tales were thousands of years old. And that wacky idea of his was debunked as soon after the Grimm brothers published their stories in 1812. Well, it turns out he might have been right. So in a paper that was published in about 2018, yeah, and we're going to go back to the awesomeness of slideshow full screen so you can actually see what I'm talking about. And then I'm paging through really quickly to get to, we've gone a far away, friends. In a paper published a few years back in Royal Society Open Science, Sarah Graça da Silva, who's a social scientist and folklorist with the New University of Lisbon, and Jamshid Tarani, an anthropologist with Durham University, describe a linguistic study that they carried out and why they believe that at least one fairy tale they looked at had its origins in the Bronze Age. Like this is Sparta time, but before Homer, right? I got coached up on some of the methodology they used to do this research, courtesy of a prof named Chris Organ, who's a buddy of mine, who's an evolutionary biologist here at MSU. And he uses a lot of the same techniques, phylogenetic analysis, which is this cool statistical tree-based mathy thing to do the research of organisms. And it turns out that you can use a similar methodology and apply it to the evolution, not just of organisms, but of language. Right? So basically the idea is that, this is from the abstract of the paper, quote, ancient population expansions and dispersals often leave enduring signatures in the cultural traditions of their descendants, as well as in their genes and languages. Of course, the study of the impact of folktales has been hampered by a lack of historical data. So what these two brilliant champions did to get around that complication was to start isolating word and concept usage and track the evolution of these elements backwards, matching up with folktales to follow proverbial linguistic breadcrumbs back to the origins of various fairy tales. So here's an example: dragons, right? Dragons appear across cultural boundaries, like all over the place, But if you track the idea of how dragons are and what they do and how they're articulated in culture. So for example, if you got an evil dragon like Smaug here, Tolkien's Germanically inspired incarnation of deception and destruction dragon, right? That's possibly a dragon that came down one linguistic branch, and then down other linguistic branch, you might have one inspired by Chinese mythos, right? Which are in Chinese mythology, dragons are figures of wisdom and and essentially kind of glory, very, very opposite or different from the scary dragon that we just saw before, right? So these are ideas that started out in one way that and then possibly bifurcated and evolved, right? Which is so cool. And the authors of this paper are hypothesizing that some proto-fairy tales, right, originated back in a time when Western and Eastern European, Indo-European languages split, which is approximately 5,000 years ago, which means that some of these stories would predate the Bible or even parts of Greek mythology. And why is this almost inappropriately exciting for me? Well, it harkens back to the concept we were talking about before, that the things that make us who we are from our most basic beginnings are the stories we tell. Stories about how people can behave, how they should behave, stories about the nature of our people, whoever our people is, right? National stories even about who, as a nation, we want to be or we have to be. This is right up Yuval Harari's alley, right, from *Sapiens*, who was on the fall T&C syllabus. And the thing that's really encouraging to me about this whole sort of tapestry is that the idea that this evolution of story offers some hope, to me at least, that we can alter our stories or make up new ones. That I can tell an individual story that replaces ideas of self-doubt or self-hatred with a story of worthiness and joy. And maybe so too, nations could replace their identity stories of acquisition and conquest with something else entirely. It's a good story at least. And I think that with the idea of telling stories from your point of view, one way in goes back to this question of what if. You can ask yourself, what if people behave differently? Or what if the world wasn't like this, but it was different in some other way? That can be about, economics. Maybe we don't exchange money. Maybe it's about, I really think that there's an old Justin Timberlake movie called In Time. It should have been called Just in Time, because why not? But basically people had clocks on their arms. And time was currency. And so basically people who were struggling to get by had very little time left. And people who are rich had all the time in the world. And it's like a cliche, but it also works really, really well as a world building question. And it's just one tweak, right? Everything in the world works very similarly, except for some echoes that happen from that. If gods are real, if the angel from the very old man with enormous wings, what if that was a world that people lived in on the daily, and old scabby angels and also young sort of bright angels dealt with humans? That's one detail, it's one what if, and you can kind of just tell the story from there or follow your nose from there. So just tweak something, just make a change, just make one little change. Ursula Le Guin, who wrote Omelas, she wrote a quintessential or a very powerful book called The Wizard of Earthsea, right, which took place on this place called Earthsea, which essentially the Earth is an archipelago of small islands, right, which creates diverse series of cultures. I mean, we have it in Micronesia and Indonesia, right, on our Earth. And you have anthropological things that happen with that. That makes for smaller communities. It makes for more languages. It makes for a focus on nautical travel rather than horse travel, right? And so the world in which these stories pop up can happen like that. And the key here is that you can also use like weird things that fascinate you from your other classes. So for example, like if you are a mechanical engineer and you are just totally gobsmacked by, I don't know, fluidics, I think that that's a thing. Take a detail from that and pop it into the world where we live and put some people next to it, and away you go. And tell us a story about that. Another thing, that's like your life, right? But another thing that you can focus on is like what are you obsessed with right now in terms of like how people are with each other, your relationships with other humans. Like take your, you know, you don't necessarily need to tell them, but take your relationship with your roommate and put the both of you in space and make a conflict, and there's your story. And work out some alternate endings if that's challenging for you. Anyway, that's a whole lot of sort of like vague suggestions, and we have a bit more time for our hour, so I'm happy to entertain any more questions as well. In just one second, I want to share with you a last quotation from one of my idols, Philip Pullman, who wrote, among other things, the His Dark Materials trilogy. It's this: after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the things we need most in the. And then I muted myself. That's my presentation. That's my talk. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that you're nice to me, and I hope that you have questions for me so that we can talk more about this stuff, because I really like to.
Awesome. Thanks, Kent.
You bet.
Yeah, everybody, if you have questions, just go ahead and unmute yourselves or drop your questions in the chat. I'll put the attendance link in the chat as well, but ask away for questions.
And I have a question about your writing process, because it was really cool listening to you talk, because we have a lot of similar inspirations with like mythology and folk tales, and I'm
Sure.
literally like on a kick right now with folk tales, so I'm looking at folklorist like master's programs. So I would love to talk to you another time.
Oh,
But
sure.
yeah, but how do you maintain motivation? Because the initial idea is so exciting, but how do you maintain it for like, especially like a book?
Yeah, that's a really Kate, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that it's really good to become friends with is the idea that as you're making something, um, there's sort of an idea in an image in my head of like, oh wow, you know, writing is just about like wandering around in a garden, and a bee or a bluebird sits on your shoulder and whispers like cool things in your ear, and then you go in and you write some and you have some tea. And I think that part of that is really deceptive, right? Sometimes sometimes it's about, when I'm talking about motivation, I think it's making friends with the idea that sometimes one will not be motivated, and that then the idea is it's still okay to do work, um, and to type things down, and even like come up with other ideas or walk away. Um, and essentially, one of my favorite quotes is by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he basically said, you know, somebody asked him about the muse, right? So the muses are these 9 sort of demiurges from the Greeks that come down to us and like give us these give us ideas, right? And inspire us. They breathe upon us. The root of inspire is to be breathed upon from the gods, right? By the gods. And they inspire us, and then like we're off to the races. But what Garcia Marquez said was, when the muse finally arrives, she will find me at my desk writing. And I think that that's really like, when it comes to motivation, it's not exactly, I hope that this is kind of an answer to your question, but part of it is becoming the friends with the idea that sometimes it's about trusting that there are troughs in the motivational process, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I need to stop writing. It just means that I shouldn't try to judge myself for whether or not I find it good. My writing process is all about trusting that sometimes the poop that I churn out by the page, I will eventually later be able to polish it into something interesting. And so it's making friends, I think, with the idea that it's a long game, and also making friends with the idea that sometimes you're going to be pissed at yourself, and sometimes you're not going to enjoy what you're making, and that is a really natural part of the process, as opposed to an indication that you're doing it wrong or that your story is no longer good. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
So I have a quick question. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering, like, as you write, at what point do you like keep like stuff to yourself, and at what point do you actually show it to other people? Like, what
Yeah.
makes the cut?
That's a really good question. My personal process now, like I'm working on a new novel right now, and I've been working on it for about a year and a half. And my sweetie is my first reader, and she's read some of it, but only as of about 3 months ago. But also that's for like we're talking about like 120,000 word, like fantasy whodunit novel with a big crazy world and stuff like that. And we've been talking all the way about ideas. I think when you're ready to show somebody else it's kind of similar to like a paper process. For some people, it's pretty early. I know a guy named Maurice Broadus, who's a writer in he's a writer in Indianapolis. One of my favorite books that he's written. He's an African-American guy, and he basically blends his world with steampunk. And so my favorite book by him is one called Pimp My Airship. But Maurice, basically, when he starts a project, he has a whole bunch of friends over to his house, and they have snacks. And he's like, okay, y'all, I want to write about this. I've got this whiteboard. I bought you pizza. Let's go. And they basically talk about it from there. And the people that are interested, he keeps up correspondence with. So, like on the weekly or on the monthly. Another way to do it is to like get with an accountability group of people that you know and that you trust, and be like, we're going to meet every month, and we're going to share our stuff, or we're going to meet every month, and a week before our meeting, we're all committing ourselves to producing something. We're not going to judge what shape it's in, and we're going to put it out there. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. I personally like to, with my novels, I like to put quite a few things on a page and then get them to a place where I get through a first draft, and then I go back through and I work through it again. A great phrase that I heard somebody say is that the first draft, the only obligation a first draft has is to exist. Right? That there's nothing else for it. Like put it down on a page, finish it, and its only job is to be there. After that, you come back and you go in and you're like, oh, wow, this is all poop, except for this paragraph gives me a really good idea for what I want this story to be. That's fine. And that's a good place to be. And like I do a first draft, I come back, I do that process, and then generally I share it with people who I trust, and who I work with, essentially in a writing group and a workshop group that I'm in. And we start sharing from there, and they give me their notes, and then I go back to the salt mines. Okay.
Cool, thank you.
You bet.
I guess I have another question, unless someone else wants to jump in. I'm curious, like, if you approach writing like short things or long things, or like a play versus a book versus an essay, like, do you have a different approach for it? Is it a very similar approach? Like, as long as it's all still building a story world, is it approached really similarly?
Yeah, it's really different. For me, it's different. My processes are, they sort of vary, but I'd say generally, I guess you could say that I start with a brainstorming process usually. which is making like a visual map. I mean, you can see some of the this is some of the stuff. This is the vision board that I'm using right now for the book that I'm working on right now. And it's like collecting things, like a picture of the snow monkeys, right, in Japan, and this quote from James Joyce that what a writer needs is silence, exile, and cunning, and also a map that I drew, and also some bullet points and some schedules, and also like I collect ideas and inspirations, and then I start mushing them together in a visual way because I work visually. And then from there, I usually try to like draft out an outline or something like that. Yeah, but I think part of the process of like this whole creative vibe is trusting and trying out different things and like paying attention to your own mindset and being like, wow, you know what? I work really well with music, or you know what? I need silence and exile and cunning, or oh, you know what? The way that I create is I work with somebody else. Part of the process is constantly being available and paying attention to yourself and like what gets you going and also what doesn't, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. You bet. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. So for our project 3 in Text and Critics, we're supposed to like write a story that answers or explores a question that have been brought up with the other texts. How, like, we have these crazy world ideas and stuff. Like, how do you build that into a short story while like staying on that track of this is supposed to help build or show this question better? Like, what are some tips for that?
I think sure, and also hi Bryce. Hey, it's good to see you. I think for a short story, I think I really love For Want of a Nail as a kind of a map of whether or not you're interested in AI, right? One of the things that it does really well is it has a couple of characters. It has a limited amount of sort of settings, and there's a whole lot of there's things that you know that Mary Kowal thought of that she doesn't necessarily talk about, like the fact that these two people are really comfortable with the idea that there is a recycling board, for example, for the people in their families. That's something that they talk about. They don't really explain it, and some people get upset about that idea, but really that for me is a great example of world building where it's about you zoom into a narrow slice of this setting and you focus on like one or maybe two issues that you think that you can really spend enough time to explore. Like it's really about like relationship and memory and maybe a little bit like about artificial intelligence, right? And there are lots of things that people can put on it, like our TNC conversations about that story go all over the place. But like the question is like how the question is make as big of a world as you want, but zoom into a very specific part of it that you find compelling and that also talks to the story that you want to talk to. If you're really interested in fairness or justice, I mean, maybe don't have a scene in a bagel shop unless there are two people that are like, unless it's about like a fair distribution of a bagel, right? I mean, does that make sense? Is that maybe helpful? Yeah. It can definitely feel, once you get a good idea, it can definitely feel like, well, I need to share every aspect of this with the people who are going to be reading it so they can understand it. And also just because I think it's so cool. But you don't need to. You just need to tell the slice of story. And just give us absolutely the minimal necessary amount for us to understand what's going on.
Thank you. That helped a lot.
Yeah, you bet. Good.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Anybody else? Cool. Thanks. This is fun. Something I say to my students a lot about this exercise and also about constructing things in general is don't try to, the thing that's going to stop you in your tracks the most is pressuring yourself to make something great. Just make something. Just get something out on the page and don't, I pray to you, don't judge it until it's out there. And then trust yourself to noodle around with it and make it better. That is what all of us do. That is what everybody who makes anything creative, that's what we do. We make poop and then we shine it. So don't feel like you need to have a shiny poop. That is my very, very academic thing that I'm going to close my talk with. Okay. Thank you to the Honors Presents team and everybody. This has been awesome. Thanks for showing up, y'all.
Thanks for doing this, Kent. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really cool.
Bye, you bet. Oh yeah, shout out for my Studies in World Building class, Honors 494. It's a upper division seminar, as well as my Discovering Shakespeare class, which is also an upper division seminar. So come hang out. Hopefully classes will be fun. Bye, y'all. Thank you so much.